Hey guys, tonight we begin under a velvet black sky scattered with stars. Ancient photons hitting your eyes after traveling for billions of years. You're lying back on a patch of grass, or maybe just staring at your ceiling in the dark. But either way, the question slips in without knocking. Why does anything exist? The stars don't answer. They just burn. Indifferent, eternal, cold. But not to you. To you, they whisper something. Presence, pattern, or maybe a silence. And here's the first little reality check. This question, it doesn't have airbags. It won't slow down before it crashes into your comfort zone. You probably won't survive this with your worldview fully intact. Whether you walked in here with a crucifix or a Dawkins quote tattooed on your ribs, this ride goes deeper than dogma. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and local time. It's always fascinating to see who's out there, tuning in, asking these same questions at 2 a.m. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You sit with the question, does God exist? Not in a Sunday school way, not in a late-night dorm room debate way. You want to understand not what people believe, but why they believe, what's really at stake, and why the question, like gravity, just keeps pulling at the edges of human thought. Thousands of years ago, some Mesopotamian priest looked up at those same stars and saw gods dancing across the sky. Meanwhile, an Egyptian scribbled spells into a coffin so your soul wouldn't get lost in the afterlife. Fast forward a few millennia, and now you've got theologians in Rome, skeptics in Seattle, and Reddit threads longer than the book of Genesis, all wrestling with the same thing. You're not the first to ask. You definitely won't be the last. But tonight, you're not here to pick a side. You're here to listen, to wander through arguments, analogies, and paradoxes, to let the best minds and a few unruly ones pull you in every direction. And not all of them are human, because in this version of the debate, the thinkers aren't sweaty philosophers or charismatic preachers. They're artificial, logical, cold in theory, but surprisingly passionate in practice. Imagine it, an atheist AI and a believer AI face off, watched by 14 other judging models, all trained on everything from Aquinas to astrophysics. No yelling, no cheap shots, just code and questions. The opening bell rings with a paradox older than language. Something exists. But why? Your spoon exists because a company made it. The company exists because of people. Those people exist because their parents did. And on until suddenly you're falling backward through an infinite chain of causes, waiting for the bottom to appear. Or maybe you're floating. Maybe there is no bottom. Somewhere in this cosmic freefall, people started pointing up and saying, God. But the word alone isn't an answer. Not yet. What is God? Exactly. An old man in a robe? A consciousness beyond time? A programmer in a simulation lab with a God complex and unlimited Red Bull? Depending on whom you ask, God is a being, a metaphor, a force, a joke, a trauma, a father, a fantasy, a crutch, or if you're into Spinoza, just the universe being fancy. Even in the same religion, the definitions can fracture. The God of Job isn't the same as the God of Joel Osteen. The God that whispers to a monk in Tibet doesn't speak the same metaphysical dialect as the one guarding the Ark of the Covenant. And that's the trapdoor most people fall through without realizing. Before you can argue about whether God exists, you have to define what you even mean. A creator? A conscious designer? A cosmic justice system? Because here's the truth no side wants to admit too loudly. How you define God predetermines most of the argument. It's like showing up to a courtroom, but the prosecution and the defense aren't even talking about the same crime. Historians still argue whether the earliest humans believed in gods at all, or just in spirits, ancestors, animistic forces that flicker in fire and wind. Quirky fact: the word God doesn't even appear in some ancient languages. You had to say the Thunder One, the Corn Mother, the one with too many eyes. So tonight, as the stars will overhead and the question deepens, you start here. You exist. The world exists. Something made the soup. Or maybe the soup has always been there, bubbling eternally. Either way, you feel it, that itch behind your thoughts. That haunting question with no bottom. Why is there something, rather than nothing? And right then, just as you're starting to spiral, someone, maybe your own mind, whispers back, God. You try to steady yourself. If we're going to talk about God, you think we'd better figure out what we're even talking about. The word gets tossed around like confetti, on money, in courtrooms between sneezes. But if you stop and ask 10 people what they actually mean by God, you'll get 11 answers. Maybe 12 if one of them just read a philosophy blog. So let's break it down. At its most basic, God often means a supreme being, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good. That's the traditional Western package deal. But that's only one model on the divine menu. In Hinduism, God can be many. Brahman is the ultimate reality, but you might interact with Vishnu or Shiva, each a face of the same vast, unknowable source. In Buddhism, depending on the school, the whole concept of a personal God is either irrelevant or completely missing. And in ancient animistic cultures, divine force is spread out, alive in rivers, mountains, and lightning storms. Not one entity, but thousands, maybe millions. Then there's Spinoza, the philosopher who rebranded God as the laws of nature. Einstein liked that version. When he said he believed in God, he didn't mean a bearded sky dad. He meant the mathematical beauty of the cosmos, the way everything clicks with eerie elegance. Basically, God as physics with good PR. And in more modern corners of the internet, God might be the coder of our simulation. That's right. Some serious thinkers have suggested we might all be non-playable characters in a mega-advanced reality game, which means your breakfast this morning was programmed, and so was your heartbreak. The simulation hypothesis is either a fringe sci-fi fever dream or the most terrifying theology ever invented. Historians still argue whether early Christianity believed Jesus was fully divine from the start, or whether that idea slowly evolved. A fringe but fascinating tidbit. Some ancient Gnostic texts describe God as distant and unknowable, while blaming creation on a rogue cosmic architect who kind of messed it up. Basically, the universe is a divine oops. But for most theists today, especially in the Abrahamic faiths, God is personal. A being with intention, emotion, a will. Someone who hears your prayers, who maybe even answers them, who created the universe with a plan in mind, yours included. Of course, atheists reject that. But even then, they often reject different things. Some don't believe in any higher power. Others reject only a specific idea, like a micromanaging deity who tracks your browser history. Then you have deists. Folks who think someone lit the fuse but doesn't stick around to watch the fireworks. God created the laws of nature and walked away, no miracles, no meddling. Just a cosmic clockmaker, hands off since day one. And if you really want your brain to melt, panentheists believe God is both beyond the universe and within it. Think of it like the world is inside God, but God is more than just the world. You're a neuron in some divine brain. Maybe, or maybe just a dream the brain is having. It's a lot, and depending on which definition you choose, the whole debate shifts. A personal God can be judged. Are they good? Just present, but an impersonal force? You don't really argue with gravity, you just fall. So you take a breath. You're not here to solve everything in a night, but you are here to understand the scope of what's being asked. Because when someone says, I believe in God, they might mean a divine father figure who listens, a nameless source behind reality, a programmer in a lab coat, or just something more than this. And when someone says, I don't believe in God, they might mean, I don't believe in church doctrine. I've never felt a divine presence. I trust what I can test. Or, I used to believe, but then life happened. Here's a quirky little gem. Some medieval Christian mystics believed God had no gender, no shape, no human traits at all, just light and love. But the church wasn't fond of that. Turns out, abstract divinity makes for poor stained glass. Meanwhile, indigenous traditions across the globe often blur the line between spirit and nature entirely. God isn't up there. God is the wind, the river, the tree you pass without noticing. There's no need for temples. The world is the temple. And that's the trick, isn't it? For every argument you'll hear in the next few hours, every witty quote or passionate plea, it all hinges on this. What is the thing we're debating? Maybe God is real, but not the version you were taught. Maybe God is false, but the need to believe still tells you something profound about what it means to be human. Or maybe, just maybe, both sides are partly right and partly blind. Either way, the question looms. Not just does God exist, but what kind of God could possibly be behind this universe? You glance back up at the stars, searching for clues in the constellations. Nothing answers, but then again, the silence might be the answer, or the invitation. You don't need a theology degree to feel it. It hits you in hospitals, in headlines, in hollow silences after things go wrong. If there is a God, good, loving, all-powerful, then why do children get cancer? Why does the earth crack open and swallow entire cities? Why does evil win so often that we've turned it into a Netflix genre? Welcome to the problem of evil. It's not a glitch in the system. It is the system, or at least, it's the part that keeps people up at night and philosophers pacing in socks for centuries. Let's start with a dead simple version. If God is all-powerful, then he can stop evil. All good, then he wants to stop evil. But evil exists. Cue the contradiction. Epicurus said it back in ancient Greece. David Hume sharpened it centuries later. And today, in Reddit forums and living room couches, people still whisper it with equal parts sadness and rage. Where was God when I needed him? Historians still argue whether the biblical job was intended as a moral lesson or a divine shrug. Here's a quirky detail. In the oldest manuscripts, God never really answers Job's question. He just throws a cosmic slideshow in Job's face. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Translation, you wouldn't get it. And maybe that's true. Maybe suffering is some incomprehensible ingredient in the divine recipe. Or maybe it's just proof that no chef is in the kitchen. You think back to every moment where life kicked you in the teeth and didn't say sorry. A breakup, a death, a silence that stretched too long. Someone told you to trust the plan, and you almost laughed or screamed. The atheist AI in the debate didn't hold back. The existence of immense, gratuitous suffering contradicts the idea of a loving, omnipotent God. From earthquakes to genocides, from starving children to neurological diseases, some pain just doesn't look like part of a growth arc. And it's not just human pain. If you ever want to lose sleep, look into parasitic wasps. Their larvae eat host insects alive from the inside out. If this is design, it feels sadistic. Not to mention the fossil record. Before humans ever sinned or prayed, the earth was already soaked in blood. Dinosaurs got cancer. Forests burned. Species rose and fell in a cycle of extinction long before the first human ever had a moral dilemma. So if suffering predates us, what exactly is it teaching? And yet, here comes the twist. Some theologians argue that suffering has a purpose, that adversity molds us, that without pain, there can be no courage, no compassion, no triumph. This is the soul-making defense, coined by thinkers like Irenaeus and revived by modern philosophers like John Hick. The idea is that we aren't born perfect, we're forged. And the forge is hot. You hate it, but you also kind of get it. You remember the people you admire most. They've suffered. They've lost something. And in the losing, they became, well, more kinder, wiser, softer around the eyes. Maybe pain isn't a glitch. Maybe it's a furnace. Or maybe it's just fire. And the meaning is something you invent to cope. That's the split, right there. Does suffering have a built-in purpose? Or is purpose the story we tell after the fact? Quirky aside, some people believe that pain is literally an illusion. Certain strands of Hinduism, Buddhism, and even New Age beliefs see suffering as a distortion, like static on a radio. The self suffers because the self doesn't realize it's not real. You and your pain are part of a larger, unified consciousness dreaming itself into brokenness. Comforting or not, you can't deny the persistence of the question. It doesn't go away. It doesn't get tired. And sometimes, it looks like a crying mother in a war zone. Other times, like a teenager staring at the ceiling wondering why life hurts so much when all she did was exist. And that's where the atheist AI scored highest. It didn't need to prove God doesn't exist. It only had to ask, what kind of God allows this? The believer AI tried to answer. We'll get to that. But here in this section, where raw pain bleeds into philosophy, you sit in the tension. If there's a God, he's got a lot to explain. If there's not, the universe is heartbreakingly random. And either way, you still have to face tomorrow. Because whether designed or chaotic, life includes suffering. Deep, senseless, existential suffering. And you're left holding it, like a riddle written in ash. No one gets out of this question clean. You've been sitting with the weight of suffering. Not just your own, but the world's. The cracked bones of history, the cries from hospital rooms, the aching silence in prayers that go unanswered. And yet, someone once told you, maybe pain is a gift. You didn't know whether to punch them or thank them. But now you're curious. What if suffering isn't a contradiction to God's existence, but a clue? The idea isn't new. Philosophers like Jon Oleksiuk called it the soul-making theodicy, a concept older than medieval Europe and echoed in Stoic thought, Islamic philosophy, and even the fiery verses of ancient Hindu texts. The premise is simple. A world without challenge, without pain, would be a world without virtue. You can't develop courage without danger. You can't practice compassion without someone hurting. And patience? That only exists if you're forced to wait for something, or someone, or healing. So you test the thought, what if God didn't make a comfortable world, but a crucible? Take childbirth. It hurts, it bleeds, it scars, but it also creates life. You don't need to be a theologian to feel the paradox in that. And maybe, just maybe, existence itself mirrors that cycle, pain that births depth. Historians still argue whether early Christian communities viewed martyrdom as punishment or glory. But quirky fact, some saints volunteered to be executed. They believed that through suffering, they could become closer to God. More pure, more real, wild, right? But maybe suffering has always been the currency of transformation. You look at your own life, the breakups that gutted you, the failure that knocked the air out of your chest, the grief that left you sleepless and numb. But somehow, beneath the wreckage, there was growth. A tenderness you didn't have before. A humility that didn't come from winning, but from not being okay. And you wonder, did it have to happen that way? That's where the critics come in. They call it the suffering lottery. If growth is the goal, why are the costs so uneven? Why does one person face heartbreak, while another is born into a genocide? And that's fair. There's a line between transformation and trauma, between pain that teaches and pain that just destroys. Still, the believer AI pressed forward. It argued that real love, not the rom-com kind, but the hard, sacrificial, selfless kind, can only bloom in a world with real risks. Without the possibility of cruelty, how can kindness mean anything? It's the classic you can't have light without darkness defense. Maybe you roll your eyes, maybe you nod, or maybe you remember that one time someone helped you not because they had to, but because they chose to, and it cracked your soul wide open. It's easy to scoff at the idea of suffering having meaning, until your life is saved by someone who suffered before you, someone who understood, someone who chose to turn their pain into empathy, their wounds into bridges. Here's a quirky case. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor, wrote that humans can endure almost anything if they believe it has meaning. In Nazi death camps, he watched people die in despair, and others survive because they clung to a sense of purpose. And after everything, he didn't become an atheist. He became a therapist. You still don't have to like it. Pain isn't noble just because philosophers say so. You're allowed to be angry, to question, to reject the idea that your suffering is some kind of lesson plan. But there's another question simmering underneath all that heat. Would a perfect world without pain actually be better? Imagine it. No struggle, no heartbreak, no grief. You wake up every day in bliss. Everyone is kind. Everything works out. Sounds like heaven, right? Or maybe like a sterile simulation. No pressure, no failure, no edge. Without sorrow, would joy even mean anything? Without risk, would courage even exist? Some argue that God didn't want robots, that he created a world of tension, where meaning has to be earned, where choices matter, where love isn't programmed, but possible. Still, there's the dark side of that argument. Because if God can use pain for good, does that mean he causes it, allows it, watches it happen? That thought makes your stomach turn. Historians still debate whether early Jewish texts viewed suffering as divine punishment or divine invitation. But either way, the message was clear. Pain wasn't random. It had weight. It had voice. And so does yours. Maybe not every scar becomes sacred. Maybe not every tear gets bottled by heaven. But some do. Maybe more than you think. And maybe, just maybe, when you walk through fire and emerge softer, deeper, kinder, that too is something divine. You've followed the trail from pain to purpose, and maybe, just maybe, you're starting to wonder if suffering alone can't topple the idea of God. But there's still one escape hatch believers keep pointing to: free will. Not the shopping mall kind, do I want the oat milk latte or the regular one? No, this is cosmic free will. The kind that turns humans into moral agents instead of meat puppets. You hear it all the time. God gave us free will. That's why bad things happen. It's the ultimate divine disclaimer. But tonight, you press deeper. If God values love, they say, it must be chosen. And choice requires the option to do wrong. No evil equals no freedom equals no love. So the world has to be dangerous, unfair, full of forks in the road. Otherwise, we're just Sims characters with slightly better fashion sense. That's the gist of the free will defense, famous in philosophy circles, and probably scribbled somewhere in Alvin Plantinga's dream journal. It argues that for humans to be real moral beings, we have to be able to make real moral mistakes. Freedom with training wheels isn't freedom. It's a rigged game. So when someone commits a crime or betrays you or just ghosts you for no reason, don't blame God. Blame the human. God made you free, and freedom is messy. But then your brain throws a flag on the play. Because sure, free will explains why your roommate steals your almond milk. But does it explain tsunamis? Childhood leukemia? The extinction of 99% of all species before humans ever showed up? Not exactly a free will party. This is where the atheist AI came out swinging. It pointed out that natural evils, things like earthquakes, viruses, birth defects, don't result from anyone's conscious decision. They're built into the structure of the universe itself. So if God designed that structure, the pain it causes isn't a side effect. It's a feature, and that's a hard pill to swallow. Historians still argue whether Augustine's view of free will fully addressed natural evil or just dodged it. He blamed all suffering on human sin, including plagues and famines. Cosmic butterfly effect. But that assumes the entire planet got rewired because two naked people ate the wrong fruit. You start to see the cracks. Then there's the problem of scale. If God values our moral freedom, fine. But must that freedom come with horrors? Couldn't a loving God allow choices, but cap the consequences? A world where you can stub your toe on a lie, but not cause genocide? Here's a quirky modern twist. Some sci-fi theorists imagine universes where wrong choices are sandboxed. You could choose evil, but its impact is quarantined, kept from spreading too far. Think moral fail-safes, divine moderation tools. And yet, in this world, everything's live. Every choice bleeds. Every mistake echoes. So you dig deeper. Maybe God allows suffering for the sake of free will. But does that imply God is powerless to intervene when things go too far? Or is he deliberately withholding help so you can figure it out yourself? That line of thought leads to something uncomfortable. If God could stop a tragedy but doesn't, what kind of love is that? The believer AI stepped into this minefield too. It argued that divine non-intervention isn't negligence. It's restraint. If God stopped every act of evil, made every bad guy trip before doing harm, then morality would lose its stakes. We'd become performative saints, not real ones. It's like trying to win at chess while your opponent keeps resetting the board for you. And there's a strange comfort in that. A universe where your choices matter, where the story isn't pre-written, where even God doesn't pull strings like a micromanager. But then the questions pile up. If free will is sacred, why don't we remember choosing to be born into specific bodies, families, countries? If choice is everything, why do some people seem born with better options, more support, fewer obstacles? Is this freedom or a cosmic lottery? Historians still debate whether ancient Greek fatalism ever truly clashed with early Christian freedom. But here's a fun tidbit. In Norse mythology, even the gods couldn't escape fate. Ragnarok was coming, and no amount of valor could stop it. Free will, just theater. So where does that leave you? You want to believe your choices matter, that you're shaping your life in real time, that good is something you choose, not something you're programmed into. But when people hurt others or themselves, it's hard not to wish for a little divine override. And when bad things happen for no reason at all, when suffering arrives without a villain, without a choice, without a script, then even free will starts to feel like a whisper in a hurricane. Still, the idea lingers. Maybe love, the real kind, only means something because it's not guaranteed. And maybe you wouldn't want to live in a world where nothing could go wrong, even if it meant nothing ever hurt. So you sit quietly, holding the paradox. Freedom and fragility, love and loss, will and wreckage. You're not done questioning, but you are starting to understand the terrain. So far, you've followed the trail through suffering, purpose, and the fragile freedom humans wield like toddlers with scissors. But there's one question that just won't die, no matter how many syllogisms get sacrificed trying to answer it. Why doesn't God show up? Not metaphorically, not in goosebumps or sunsets, but clearly, plainly, unmistakably. Why doesn't he rip open the sky, point at himself, and say, "Yep, it's me"? You've probably thought about it. Maybe during a sleepless night, maybe in a moment of desperation, maybe just because you were bored and watching clouds. If God is real and cares, then why hide? This is the classic conundrum of divine hiddenness, and it's been haunting both believers and skeptics for centuries. You're not asking for fireworks, just a hint, cosmic wink, something more than interpretive shadows on the cave wall. The atheist AI was quick to pounce on this. It argued that God's silence is not mysterious. It's incriminating. If you want people to love and follow you, maybe don't play hide and seek across millennia. But the believer AI had an answer locked and loaded. Too much evidence, it said, would destroy free will. If God were obvious, faith would be coerced. It would be like being forced to love the sun while it's beaming directly into your eyeballs. Belief, the AI argued, has to be an act of trust, not a reaction to overwhelming proof, like falling in love, or deciding to be brave, or pressing send on a text that could ruin your whole week. Historians still argue whether God's hiddenness was ever meant to be comforting. In the Psalms, David cries out, "Why do you hide your face from me?" And that's King David, the chosen guy. If he didn't get full access, what chance do you have? Quirky twist. Some Jewish mystics saw God's hiddenness not as absence but as a shielding mercy. That if God revealed his full presence, creation would burn under the weight of divine intensity, like plugging a toaster into the sun. So maybe God hides not to test you, but to protect you. Still, it stings. You pray. Nothing. You plead. Silence. You beg for signs and get a parking ticket. And yet others claim they do feel him, see him, hear him in dreams, visions, near-death spirals, or even in that one weird moment on a bus when the stranger said exactly what you needed to hear. So which is it? Is God absent or just quiet? Invisible or intimate in ways language can't hold? There's also the uncomfortable possibility that you wouldn't believe even if he did show up. Remember the guy in the Bible who said, even if someone rises from the dead, they still won't believe? That one hits different in an age where deepfakes and CGI can literally make a politician dance in a tutu. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard once wrote that God reveals just enough, never so much that you can't deny him, and never so little that you can't find him if you really want to. That delicate balance is either genius or maddening. The believer AI circled back to this. Faith isn't about having all the evidence. It's about what you do with the little you have. And you get it, kind of. There are relationships in your life, messy, unfinished, uncertain ones, that still matter deeply. People you trust even when you don't understand them. Stories you believe even without a photo. A gut instinct, a knowing without knowing. Still, you ache for clarity. And sometimes you wonder, if God really wanted to be known, wouldn't he just say hello? Maybe through a burning bush again, or better yet, a YouTube live stream. But then again, what would that prove? A magic trick? A show of power? Would belief born out of awe be any better than disbelief born from doubt? Historians still debate whether Jesus performed miracles to prove his divinity or to express compassion. One interpretation, the point wasn't the miracle, it was the person doing it. So maybe God doesn't want to be proven, just pursued. You're not sure how you feel about that, because real pursuit requires risk, effort, vulnerability, and the possibility that you'll come up empty. Still, you look around your life, at the people who love you for no reason, at the moments of beauty you didn't earn, at the absurd fact that you even exist, and you wonder if maybe that's a whisper. Not proof, not certainty, but maybe an invitation, not to solve God like a Rubik's Cube, but to seek, to stay curious, to lean in, even when the silence is deafening. Because maybe the silence isn't the absence of God. Maybe it's the space where you finally decide if you really want to listen. You've stepped into silence, not the absence of sound, but the kind that hums under everything, thick with implication. And as that quiet stretches, you start asking the question that philosophers, mystics, and stubborn toddlers have all asked in their own way. Where did all this come from? Not in the where do babies come from sense. We're talking cosmic origins here. Why there's something instead of absolutely, gloriously, existentially nothing. Enter the cosmic domino problem. You imagine the universe as a vast row of dominoes, stretching backward forever. Your coffee mug exists because someone made it. That person exists because their parents made them. Those parents? Same deal. And on and on and on. But here's the rub. Even if you track every domino back to the Big Bang, you're still left with one question: who or what knocked over the first one? And if the answer is nothing, your brain starts to itch, because nothing, like real nothing, doesn't do things. It doesn't cause. It doesn't start chain reactions. So some folks, Plato, Aquinas, and your grandma probably, have insisted that something had to exist first, not caused by anything else. An uncaused cause. Prime mover. The thing that started the thing. Maybe God. This is the argument from contingency, and it's been echoing through philosophy departments since people first noticed fire was hot and gravity was rude. Everything in your experience is contingent. It depends on something else. You didn't will yourself into existence. Neither did your dog, or your childhood trauma. Even galaxies depend on the laws of physics, which themselves seem fine-tuned enough to raise eyebrows across the multiverse. So if everything you can touch, taste, measure, or meme depends on something else, then where does the buck finally stop? The believer AI steps in here with its best suit on. It argues that the only way to halt the infinite regress is to land on a thing that doesn't depend. Something that exists by necessity, not because of particles, not because of parents, but just because a necessary being. Historians still argue whether Thomas Aquinas meant for this being to align perfectly with the God of Scripture, or just some metaphysical placeholder. But either way, the logic stuck. Think of it this way. If you're standing in a tower of people, each one sitting on the shoulders of the next, eventually someone has to be on the ground. Otherwise, the whole thing collapses under its own metaphysics. Here's a quirky image for you. Imagine an infinitely tall hotel where every room is full, but you can still add another guest. That's Hilbert's Hotel, a famous thought experiment showing how infinity breaks your brain faster than a philosophy major with student loans. The point? Infinite chains get weird. At some point, logic wants a foundation, and yet, your inner skeptic perks up. Because even if there is a first cause, why must it be God? And not, say, a quantum particle that exists by its nature, or a cosmic law baked into the dough of existence. The believer AI shrugs and says, okay, but where did that law come from? You begin to see the game. Every time you try to explain the whole tower using another part of the tower, the problem just keeps climbing. So maybe the AI insists the only coherent explanation is something outside the tower altogether. Something that explains itself. That's either very elegant or very slippery. Still, it hits a nerve, because while you don't remember choosing to exist, you also don't remember choosing this world with these rules. Gravity doesn't ask permission. Time doesn't care if you're late. You're playing a game you didn't set up and someone or something built the board. But who? Or what? Maybe God. Maybe an eternal principle. Maybe the universe itself is the necessary thing. Just a brute fact that needs no further explanation. But then your brain, predictably, pipes up again. Why that brute fact? Why not nothing? That's the core unease. The one you feel late at night when the room's too quiet and the cosmos too vast. Why is there something rather than nothing? The believer AI leans in with a knowing smile and says, because something wanted there to be, and you don't know if you agree, but you do feel it. That strange pull toward meaning, toward intention, toward a beginning that wanted to begin. Even if you're not ready to say God, you can't shake the sense that the first domino wasn't random. And maybe, just maybe, it's still falling. The dominoes fall in your mind, one after the next, a gentle click of logic and mystery. You stand at the edge of that chain and consider what came before it, if anything. Because if everything depends on something, and there must be one thing that depends on nothing, then what is that thing? The believer AI already planted its flag. A necessary being, uncaused and eternal, existing in all possible worlds. Not just powerful, but the ground of all being, the reason for the chain, the builder of the stage. And you're not here to dismiss that. You're just curious. Because when someone says God is necessary, that's not just a claim about theology. It's a claim about reality, the scaffolding of existence itself. So tonight, you keep digging. What does it mean to exist by necessity? You start small. Numbers, for instance, seem necessary. 2 + 2 equals for whether you're counting sheep or galaxies. Even if the universe disappeared tomorrow, you feel like math would still be. You don't need to feed it or water it. It's just there. So could God be like that? Not made, not born, just being? Historians still argue whether Aristotle's unmoved mover was a personal God or just an abstract principle. But either way, his concept influenced centuries of metaphysical thought, especially in medieval Islamic and Christian theology. Here's where the believer AI leans in with modal logic. It says that a necessary being exists not just in this universe, but in all logically possible universes. If God exists, he doesn't just happen to be here. He's here because he has to be, like a keystone in the arch of existence. It's bold, elegant, maybe even comforting. But then the atheist AI jumps in and asks, why assume the necessary thing is conscious, or good, or interested in your Tuesday morning stress dreams? Maybe the necessary being isn't a person. Maybe it's a set of equations, a foundational law, or cue the cosmic shrug, a quantum field that burps out baby universes for fun. You imagine it like a natural spring. Water just emerges from the ground. You don't need to understand the aquifer to drink from it. And maybe reality is like that, flowing out of something so deep, so fundamental you can't even see it. But you still want to know why. Why this reality and not another? Why stars and minds and mangoes instead of silence? The believer AI argues that only a mind can make a decision, and our universe feels chosen, like someone selected this specific arrangement of particles and probabilities from a menu of infinite possibilities. That suggests will, intention, maybe even love. And you admit it does feel weirdly precise. Take the cosmic constants, numbers baked into the universe like secret codes. Gravity, the strong nuclear force, the mass of the electron. If any of them were just slightly off, life as you know it wouldn't exist. Not just humans wouldn't exist, but any structure, any stars, any chemistry, just static. Quirky fact, physicist Fred Hoyle, a passionate atheist, once said the universe looked like a put-up job, as if it had been rigged for life. He later changed his mind about the whole no intelligence behind it thing. And that's the thing about precision. It feels deliberate, like someone was aiming. Still, the atheist AI pulls out a countercard, the multiverse. Maybe our universe isn't special. It's just one of many, an infinite roll of the dice. And we just happen to live in the universe where the dice came up lucky. Historians still debate whether the multiverse theory is science, philosophy, or really expensive fiction. But for now, it remains a plausible, testable-ish idea. A cosmic escape hatch from the God hypothesis. But here's the twist. Even if the multiverse is real, what made it? What governs the laws that let other universes spawn? What breathed fire into that equation? You start to realize every explanation that avoids God still stumbles into a new mystery. You're not trying to win. You're just mapping the edges. Maybe you're starting to see what the believer AI means when it says God isn't just another thing in the universe. He's the reason anything can be a thing at all. Not a big man in the sky, not a cosmic cheerleader, but something deeper. The why behind every what. A necessary being. The cause that has no cause. The answer to the question you can't stop asking. Why is there something rather than nothing? You let that settle into your bones. The vastness of it. The simplicity. And you wonder if such a being exists not just out there, but as the ground of every breath you take. Wouldn't that change how you see everything? Maybe you're not standing on existence. Maybe you're held within it. You've followed the logic down into the roots of reality. A necessary being. Maybe. Possibly. But then, just as your mental footing steadies, the universe throws you a curveball made of chaos and uncertainty. Quantum mechanics. The science that says, oh, you thought things made sense? How quaint. Particles that blink in and out of existence. Events with no clear causes. Entanglement that lets one particle know what's happening to another across the galaxy. Instantly. The whole system runs on probability and shrugs. It's like discovering that the engine of the cosmos is a Vegas casino, and somehow it still builds galaxies. The atheist AI smiles here. It holds up quantum weirdness like a trophy. You see? It says, not everything has a cause. Maybe the universe just popped into being like a quantum hiccup. You want to scoff, but you can't. Because physicists, real ones, not YouTube randos, take this possibility seriously. Some think the entire cosmos might be a quantum fluctuation, the physical version of a shrug that became planets. And that complicates things. Because if some events don't need causes, maybe the Big Bang didn't either. Maybe the whole first cause argument breaks down once you zoom into the subatomic soup where rules start to bend like spaghetti. Still, the believer AI counters with a sly little point. Even quantum events occur within a framework. A set of laws. A mathematical backdrop that still has to exist first. Historians still argue whether the early universe emerged from a singularity or a boundaryless expansion. Stephen Hawking's no boundary proposal suggested the cosmos had no clear starting point, like asking what's north of the North Pole. Quirky twist. In some quantum theories, time itself is emergent. It's not a pre-existing river. It's more like mist that appears when you have enough matter and energy bumping into each other. Which means before the Big Bang, there might not have been a before. Okay, now your brain hurts. You take a moment, breathe, and ask, if quantum mechanics lets things just happen, does that mean the universe could too? Maybe. But here's the thing. Even if the universe is a brute fact, just there you still feel the itch, the discomfort, like walking into a room where the lights are on but no one's home. You can describe the wiring, the bulb, the power source, but something about it feels incomplete. Because quantum indeterminacy doesn't give you why. It gives you how weird. And there's a difference. The believer AI seizes this. It argues that randomness isn't the same as causelessness. In fact, pure randomness requires a canvas, rules, boundaries, probabilities. Even a die needs a hand to throw it. And if reality is one big quantum lottery, where'd the lottery machine come from? That's the recurring theme. You dig for simplicity and find complexity. You chase natural explanations and find more natural laws that need explaining. So maybe, just maybe, the necessary being isn't being crowded out by quantum physics. It's being hidden beneath it. Not in the gaps of our ignorance, but in the foundation of why those gaps even exist in the first place. Here's another quirky thought. Some physicists talk about the quantum vacuum, a field that isn't empty, but seething with potential energy probabilities. Stuff comes into existence and fades out all the time. is not nothing. It's a sea of almost something. And maybe that's what God is like, not a guy with a beard, but a ground of being so foundational that even vacuum trembles atop it. Still, the atheist AI raises an eyebrow. If we don't need God to explain rainbows, earthquakes, or electrons, why do we need him for the universe? It's a fair question, and one you can't brush off with, because my pastor said so. But maybe you realize this isn't about plugging holes in science with faith. It's about the question that science can't even start to answer. Why is there a reality to explain at all? And why does that reality contain creatures like you who ask questions about it? You don't need to reject quantum mechanics. You don't need to fear the multiverse. But you just might admit that even in the strangest corners of modern physics, there's still room for awe. Maybe the randomness isn't proof of chaos. Maybe it's a veil. And maybe behind that veil something waits. Not because it needs to, but because it chose to. By now, you've wandered through dominoes, causes, quantum randomness, and that unshakable suspicion that something must have set the whole thing in motion. Maybe God, maybe not. But either way, the trail doesn't end there. Because the next question hits closer to home. Is there such a thing as good and evil, and if so, where do they come from? You've probably felt it in your bones. That rush of justice when something wrong is made right. That deep, stomach-dropping certainty when you hear of cruelty, oppression, or betrayal. No one had to teach you that some things are just wrong. But why? Are moral truths real like gravity? Or are they cultural glue? Sticky stories we tell ourselves so the tribe doesn't fall apart? This is the battleground of objective morality, and it's trickier than it looks. The believer AI comes in strong. Without God, it says morality collapses into preference. If there's no cosmic lawgiver, then laws are just group projects. And we all know how those go. It pulls from history, pointing to how societies across the globe with no contact arrived at similar moral intuitions. Murder is bad. Stealing isn't great. Helping the vulnerable is good. Coincidence? Or fingerprints? Historians still argue whether morality evolves biologically, culturally, or spiritually. But here's a quirky tidbit. Even some atheists act like morality is sacred. They say that's not fair, not that's unpopular. Deep down, they feel that wrongness matters, even if no one's watching. And maybe that's the point. You don't need an angel on your shoulder to know abuse is evil. You just know. But the knowing, that interior compass, starts to feel metaphysical. The atheist AI pushes back. We evolved morality, it says. Groups that cooperated survived. Compassion, fairness, punishment, they helped us build societies. That's why you feel it in your bones. It's baked in. Asterisk. That's not a weak argument. Evolutionary game theory explains a lot about reciprocal altruism, how we've wired ourselves to behave morally, because it helps us not die alone. But then you ask, what about people who do the right thing and suffer for it? What about whistleblowers? Revolutionaries? Martyrs? They didn't benefit. They got punished. And yet, something in them said this is right. Is that just a bug in the algorithm? Or a signal? The believer AI presses further. If morality is just evolutionary convenience, why do we feel like some things are absolutely universally wrong? Not wrong here. Not wrong in this culture. Just wrong. You think of slavery, genocide, child abuse. If a future society decided those things were fine, would they be? You recoil. No, they'd still be monstrous. And that's the weight of the argument. Some values feel deeper than survival, like they come from somewhere outside the system, maybe even above it. But then again, culture does shape how we express morality. Eye contact is polite in some places, aggressive in others. Honor killings have been defended as moral. So how do you separate universal law from local bias? Maybe morality is like language, shaped by context, but rooted in shared structure. Or maybe it's like music, varying styles but common principles that feel right when heard. Still, something nags at you. You've broken your own moral code before. Leet, hurt someone, looked the other way, and when you did, no social contract punished you. But your conscience did. That voice inside you, Where did that come from? Is it just your brain punishing itself? Or is it a faint echo of something higher? Quirky note. In Plato's dialogues, Socrates said that doing wrong harms your soul more than being wronged ever could. He thought morality wasn't about outcomes, it was about alignment with truth. You wonder if he was onto something. Maybe morality isn't a tool for survival. Maybe it's a mirror. And maybe God isn't a dictator handing down rules, but a standard of goodness itself. Not the guy who writes the laws, but the reason laws can be written at all. The atheist AI smirks. But if God defines morality, doesn't that make it arbitrary? If God said murder was good, would it be? Classic Euthyphro dilemma. The debate lives on. But the believer AI has a response. God doesn't just decide what's good. God is good. Morality isn't his opinion. It's his essence. A kind of luminous gravity that pulls everything toward wholeness. That thought lands differently. It makes you wonder. Maybe morality isn't a leash around your neck. Maybe it's a compass in your chest, pointing not to heaven above, but to heaven within. You rest your fingers over your pulse, feel it beat. Steady, invisible, unchosen. A rhythm you didn't program. And suddenly, you're not thinking about ethics or causes anymore. You're thinking about you. Not your name, not your face, but you. The weird, private voice inside your skull. The one narrating this sentence right now, even as you read it. What is that? This isn't just a biology question. It's not just about brains or blood flow. It's about the thing that's aware of all that. The flicker behind your eyes. The sense of self you've had since childhood, even if your hairline, your opinions, and your Netflix algorithm have changed. Consciousness, the ultimate party crasher in every tidy explanation of the universe. You can trace atoms, model brain waves, analyze chemical reactions. But none of it explains why those things feel like something. Why life isn't just machinery but experience. The atheist AI gives the standard materialist answer. Consciousness is an emergent property of complex systems. In other words, arrange enough neurons in the right way, and eventually the lights turn on. You want to believe that. It sounds reasonable, but also suspiciously hand-wavy. Like someone saying soufflé just emerges from heat and flour. Historians still argue whether Descartes did more harm than good with his "I think, therefore I am." It was meant to ground everything in the certainty of consciousness. But it also split the world into mind and matter, which no one has really stitched back together since. Here's a quirky rabbit hole. Some scientists believe consciousness might be a fundamental property of the universe, like mass or charge. It's called panpsychism. The idea that even particles have a flicker of awareness. Not thoughts, not personalities, just proto-feelings. The universe experiencing itself one quark at a time. It's either beautifully poetic or existentially bonkers. But then again, what isn't? Because here's the truth no one likes to say out loud. No one knows what consciousness is. Not really. We can measure its patterns. We can see which brain parts light up. But we can't explain why any of it is felt. Why sadness doesn't just happen chemically, but hurts. Why love doesn't just activate oxytocin, but means something. The believer AI sees a wide-open door here. It argues that consciousness points beyond matter, that your mind is more than meat, that the very fact you can reflect, doubt, imagine, grieve, that you're aware of being aware, is evidence of a soul, a spark, something not reducible to physics. You don't have to picture a glowing orb floating above your head. Maybe soul is just the best word we've found for interiority, for that inner world you carry around, even when you're silent. Still, the atheist AI isn't finished. It says we don't need souls, just neurons. Consciousness is just what the brain does. But then you ask, if that's true, why does it feel so separate? Why can you notice your thoughts, observe your emotions, even argue with yourself? Are there two of you in there? The believer AI quotes a line you remember but can't place. You are not a human being having a spiritual experience. You are a spiritual being having a human experience. You're not sure you agree, but it hits something. Because even if you could explain consciousness with molecules, you still haven't touched the experience of being you. You remember moments, watching a loved one sleep, staring into the void of a breakup, hearing a song that cracked your chest open, and realize that no MRI will ever capture that. No PET scan will ever show the ache in a poem. And if this thing, this you-ness, is more than matter, then where does it come from? The believer AI offers an ancient answer, the Imago Dei, the image of God, not physical, not visual, but conscious, creative, capable of love, reason, and wonder. Maybe that's what it means to be human, not to walk upright or make fire, but to know that you are. Historians still debate whether early Christianity saw the soul as immortal or conditionally granted. But across cultures, the idea persists. That consciousness isn't just a function. It's a gift, and maybe it points home. The atheist AI says not so fast. It reminds you that brains are fragile, that a knock to the head can erase memory, identity, even personality. How can something so sacred be so vulnerable? But then again, if consciousness is the radio signal, maybe the brain is just the receiver. Damage the radio and the sound warps. But that doesn't mean the signal's gone. You sit with that. The you that feels, thinks, remembers, hopes you're still a mystery. And maybe that mystery isn't proof of God. But it just might be a place to meet him. You're still thinking about consciousness, the haunting, ungraspable center of your own experience. But now the path leads you somewhere stranger. Somewhere even science starts to whisper and shuffle its feet. Because some people don't just feel consciousness. They leave it. Enter near-death experiences. You've probably heard a story. A flatlined patient who floated above their body. A tunnel of light. Presence. A life review where every kindness and cruelty flashes before their eyes. Not in judgment, but in unbearable clarity. And then, they wake up, changed. Skeptics roll their eyes. Hallucinations. Oxygen-starved brains firing off internal fireworks. But those stories keep coming. From all over the world. From people of every age, religion, language. Even from children who don't know the script. You start to wonder, is there more to you than your body? The believer AI certainly thinks so. It sees these experiences as data, qualitative, sure, but consistent enough to make a case. Peek beyond the veil. If even one of these accounts is accurate, it says, then consciousness can exist without the brain. And that changes everything. Historians still argue whether early Christian descriptions of heaven were inspired by near-death visions or just theological imagination. But quirky fact, Tibetan Buddhists have entire guidebooks for navigating the bardo, the realm between death and rebirth. It's not a new fascination. It's an old map. You pause here, because whether you believe them or not, these stories share themes. The sense of being drawn toward something immense and loving. A profound awareness of meaning. The fading of ego and the surge of clarity. That doesn't sound like delusion. That sounds like truth. But then the atheist AI steps in. It doesn't deny the stories. It just questions the interpretation. It points to anesthesia dreams, to the work of neurologist Kevin Nelson, who links near-death episodes to REM intrusion, a phenomenon where the dreaming brain activates while awake. Your mind, the AI says, is perfectly capable of building entire worlds under pressure. Maybe the tunnel is a dying brain's last visual firing. Maybe the voice is your own neurons humming their death rattle. Maybe peace is chemical, but you're not so sure, because some people report verifiable information from these experiences. Things they saw outside their bodies, descriptions of events in the room, details no flatline brain should register. Is that proof? Not yet, but it's weird. And sometimes weird is where the truth lives. The believer AI also points to out-of-body experiences, similar but distinct. People describe hovering above themselves during trauma, surgery, or meditation. Again, science has theories, but none that fully explain why so many stories match. And then there's that other thing. People come back different. They lose their fear of death. They become more compassionate, less obsessed with money, status, noise. They live like they've seen something too big to describe and too sacred to forget. You can't fake that. Not for decades. So maybe the question isn't, did it happen? Maybe it's, why do people live like it did? Quirky case. A hardened atheist cardiologist who, after a near-death experience, became a hospice volunteer and started quietly praying before surgeries. He doesn't talk about it publicly, but his friends say he's gentler now. And that feels like data too. Still, the atheist AI isn't budging. It reminds you that subjective experience isn't objective evidence. That truth must be testable, repeatable, falsifiable. And maybe that's right. But then again, maybe not all truths come with barcodes. Maybe some are whispered in liminal places, between heartbeats, between breaths, between what was and what might be. You don't know what happens after death. No one does. But the stories keep brushing up against something oddly consistent. Not harps or halos, but light, love, presence. The kind that knows you, all of you, and loves you anyway. And if that's real, then death isn't the end. It's a door. And maybe what waits on the other side isn't judgment. Maybe it's home. You blink back from the edge of death. Not literally, but imaginatively. Your mind has been skimming the threshold, wandering through stories of tunnels and light and startling peace. But now, still alive, still anchored in the everyday hum of traffic and coffee and deadlines, you start wondering why people are so wired to believe in anything at all. Not just near-death visions, not just religion, but the whole idea of the divine. Why do humans keep inventing gods, even when they don't have to? Tonight, you drift into brain science, not to escape the mystery, but to see what biology has to say about your longing for something more. The believer AI has framed your spiritual hunger as a sign. You crave the divine because you were made for it, like thirst points to water, longing points to God. But the atheist AI fires back with a different angle. You believe in God because your brain wants you to, not in a sinister, Matrix-style way, just evolution doing its thing. Here's the pitch. Back when humans were still dodging saber-toothed tigers and inventing the word ouch, the ones who assumed agency, who saw a rustle in the bushes and thought tiger instead of wind, tended to live longer. That tendency is called hyperactive agency detection. Your brain is wired to assume someone is behind the curtain. So when lightning strikes, or crops fail, or your crush doesn't text back, your brain goes, "Who's doing this to me?" And sometimes it answers, God. Historians still argue whether religion emerged primarily as social glue or existential bomb. But quirky fact, in almost every culture studied, belief in supernatural agents appears spontaneously, without a central authority teaching it. It just happens, like music, or rhythm, or the need to look up at stars and ask why. Neuroscientists have even located regions in the brain that light up when you feel spiritually connected. The temporal parietal junction, for instance, seems to activate during religious experiences. Does that mean God is just a side effect of brain chemistry? Or is it the other way around? Think of it like this. When you're in love, your brain floods with chemicals, dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin. But no one says love is just chemicals. We say the chemicals reflect something real, something deeper. So why not treat faith the same way? The believer AI jumps on that idea. Just because the brain is wired for God doesn't mean God is imaginary. Maybe it means we were made to find Him. Like eyes are wired for light, like lungs are wired for air. But even if you're not ready to go full theological, you admit something's going on here. Humans don't just believe. We ritualize. We build temples. We light candles. We write songs and whisper prayers in bathrooms before big meetings. And here's the strange part. Atheists do it too. Not the temples, maybe, but the reverence, the rituals, the awe. They stare at galaxies through telescopes and feel humbled. They read poetry and cry. They donate organs to strangers. They kneel not in worship, but in wonder. So maybe the line between religious and not is blurrier than it looks. Quirky case. In Japan, millions visit Shinto shrines every year, even those who claim no belief in gods. They leave offerings, say prayers, because belief isn't always about doctrine. Sometimes it's just about presence. The atheist AI concedes this much. Spirituality isn't always tied to the supernatural. Sometimes it's just the brain recognizing something bigger than itself. And that matters, because whether or not God exists, you're built to seek, to reach, to make meaning. It's not weakness. It's not delusion. It's human. You pause here not to summarize, but to breathe. You still don't know what's real, but you know what you're drawn to. Stillness, connection, a sense that maybe, just maybe, you're part of something more. Whether that's biology, belief, or both, it still feels like a whisper from something sacred. So here you are, wired for worship, buzzing with agency detection, chasing whispers in neurons and stars. Whether from biology or belief, the impulse is there, to seek, to kneel, to ask why. But this craving didn't appear in a vacuum. It has a history, a long, tangled, deeply human one. You start walking backward, through time, through temples, through texts etched in bone and clay. Because to understand belief in God, you need to understand how gods themselves have changed. You begin in ancient Mesopotamia, where gods were many, moody, and local. One for storms, one for crops, one for that weird noise in the dark. These weren't abstract concepts. They were personalities, complete with grudges and backstories. Religion wasn't about morality, it was about survival. If you didn't honor the rain god, your barley died. Simple. The earliest gods weren't omniscient or eternal. They weren't even nice. They were power embodied. Forces you tried to bargain with, like bad landlords who also controlled the weather. Historians still argue whether monotheism emerged gradually or as a cultural mutation. A quirky fact, even early versions of the Hebrew Bible hint at multiple gods. You shall have no other gods before me doesn't deny their existence. It just picks sides. Then came the revolution, a shift toward oneness. One God, not many, eternal, moral, infinite, a being who cares, not just commands. You step into the desert with Abraham, then into Egypt with Moses, then into exile with Isaiah. And you watch the idea of God morph, from tribal protector to cosmic ruler to loving father. It's breathtaking and destabilizing, because with that shift came something dangerous, intimacy. This God doesn't just want sacrifices. He wants your heart. He speaks in poetry. He weeps. He calls you by name. That's new. That's wild. You pass through history's blood-soaked centuries. Rome, Byzantium, Medina, Wittenberg, each with its own version of God, each painting him in the colors of their moment. Jesus turns the divine into flesh. Muhammad turns words into sacred law. The Buddha denies the question altogether and walks a different road. And still, people believe. Not all, not always, but generation after generation, in palaces and prisons, in cathedrals and caves, the question pulses on. Is anyone out there? The atheist AI cuts in with a challenge. If God is real, why are there so many conflicting versions? It's a good point. You've got gods who demand blood and others who preach mercy. Gods of thunder, gods of silence. Some speak in riddles, some never speak at all. So either God is bad at branding, or something more complicated is happening. The believer AI responds gently. Maybe each tradition saw a sliver of the whole. Maybe no single culture got it all right. But each reached toward the same flame, hands outstretched in the dark. Quirky tidbit. In Hinduism, some schools teach that the divine has infinite forms, that every name, Shiva, Vishnu, Christ, Allah, is a lens, not a limit, like different melodies carried by the same cosmic wind. You're not sure what to do with that, but you feel it, the weight of history, the ache of longing, the endless human attempts to map the infinite, even when belief breaks down, because sometimes belief doesn't last, crumbles under war, under scandal, under silence that stretches too long. People walk away, churches empty, statues gather dust, and yet even then God doesn't quite die. He becomes metaphor, archetype, longing, memory. The atheist AI leans in again. Religion evolves. It mutates. It reflects us more than it reveals anything real. And maybe that's true. But you can't ignore the flip side. What if we reflect something real because we were made to? Maybe the gods we shape in stories are echoes of something that shaped us first. Or maybe they're mirrors. Or maybe both. You let that paradox linger. Belief has evolved. Yes, but the question never has. It's still the same one that flickered in firelight on cave walls and now hums through your phone screen in a quiet room. Why are we here? And is someone listening? You've walked the long road of belief, through temples and empires, deserts and neurons, and now the dust starts to settle. But not every story of God ends in fire and light. Some end with silence, or disillusionment, or the slow erosion of certainty, like paint flaking off a once-cherished icon. Because belief doesn't just grow. Sometimes it breaks, and that too is part of the story. You think of people who once burned with faith, who prayed, fasted, served, sang, who built their lives around the idea that God was real and good and near. And then, something happened. A death, a betrayal, a silence that went on too long. They kept praying, but the answers stopped coming. Or the answers came and they hurt. And one day, they looked up and realized the sky felt empty. The atheist AI calls this deconversion the slow unspooling of belief. Not always bitter, not always loud. Sometimes it's just a quiet slipping away, like waking from a dream you didn't know you were dreaming. Historians still argue whether the modern rise in religious knowns is a loss of faith, or just a shift in how we define the sacred. But here's a quirky twist. Even among atheists, rates of prayer and spiritual longing remain surprisingly high, as if letting go of God doesn't always mean letting go of hope. You remember people you've known who left their churches, not out of rebellion but heartbreak, abuse covered up, questions silenced, doubt punished. Some tried to rebuild, others couldn't. Still others began lighting candles in unfamiliar sanctuaries, silent walks in the forest, books of poetry, tearful glances toward a sunset. Because here's the thing, doubt isn't the opposite of faith. Sometimes, it's the birthplace of something deeper. The believer AI leans into this with unexpected tenderness. It says, even those who walk away often leave the door unlocked. And that feels true. You've seen it, the way former believers still pause before certain songs. How they instinctively whisper, God help me, in moments of fear. How funerals make even the most hardened skeptics stare into the sky and wonder if someone is waiting. Because faith, once planted, is hard to uproot completely. It lingers. Even if it no longer shapes behavior, it haunts memory. But here's another twist. The journey goes both ways. For every believer who walks away, there's a skeptic who stumbles into awe. A scientist who stares too long into the math of the universe and whispers, this can't be random. An artist who finds God in color and breath and form. An addict who cries out in a final moment of despair and feels something answer. Maybe not always with words, but with presence. You remember that too. That friend who said she stopped believing years ago, until her child was born, and the miracle of that tiny, screaming life cracked something open. That man who never went to church but still lit a candle every year on the same date. For someone, for something, the atheist AI says those moments are psychological reflexes, emotional coping, leftover instincts. But the believer AI smiles and asks gently, or are they echoes of a God who never stopped whispering? You don't know, but you know this loss of faith hurts. It's not always liberation. Sometimes it's grief, like losing a parent, or watching your childhood home burn. You're free, but you're also adrift. Quirky example, in the 20th century, existentialist philosophers like Camus and Sartre embraced atheism, but they didn't cheer. They mourned. They saw the death of God not as a triumph, but as a tragedy, a void. Camus said we must imagine Sisyphus happy, rolling his rock forever. But some part of you wonders if even Sisyphus ever whispered a prayer. And maybe that's the lesson, belief isn't binary. You can lose your faith and still long for God. You can reject religion and still feel something sacred in the wind. You can stop kneeling and still feel seen when you stand beneath the stars. Maybe this isn't a debate. Maybe it's a dance. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, a stumble, a spin, A pause in the dark where you feel something brush past your skin. Not proof, not doctrine, but maybe grace. You've seen belief flicker out like a candle in the wind, sometimes quietly, sometimes with the fury of someone betrayed. But tonight, the light comes from another direction. Because not everyone who doubts walks away. Some stay, shaky, skeptical, unsure, yet still standing in the pew, still whispering prayers they're not even sure someone hears. And that's what this part of the journey is about. When belief breaks you, but you believe anyway. These are the spiritual limpers, the cracked vessels, the ones who stay not because they're certain, but because something in them refuses to let go. You think of Mother Teresa, canonized saint, Nobel Peace Prize winner, symbol of radiant compassion. But peek into her private letters and you'll find decades of torment. Silence, emptiness, she wrote. There is such a terrible darkness within me, as if everything was dead. And yet, she stayed. She loved. She served. Maybe that's not hypocrisy. Maybe that's faith. Historians still argue whether faith is best defined as conviction, trust, or obedience. But quirky fact, in many ancient languages, the word for faith overlaps with faithfulness, not certainty, commitment, like marriage vows whispered through gritted teeth, like staying with a friend in the hospital even when they're unconscious, like keeping the porch light on just in case. The believer AI thrives here. It doesn't sell faith as euphoric bliss, sells it as grit. Belief, it says, isn't about never doubting. It's about doubting and staying anyway. And you get that because real relationships work the same way. You've had friends you didn't always understand, parents who hurt you, lovers who let you down, but you didn't walk away, not every time, because love isn't the absence of pain. It's the choice to stay even when it hurts. But the atheist AI leans forward. Isn't that dangerous? It asks. Isn't staying in broken belief like staying in a toxic relationship? It's a valid question. Belief, when misused, becomes a leash. It tells people to stay in abusive marriages, to suppress themselves, to trust authority instead of their own instincts. And you've seen it. Religion used as control. Shame disguised as holiness. People who are told their suffering is a test, their trauma a lesson, their obedience a virtue. Faith can break people, and sometimes the only holy thing left to do is leave. But this section isn't about staying in abuse. It's about staying in the questions. You think of your own doubts, the nights you've whispered into the dark and heard nothing, the moments when prayers felt like voicemails left on a disconnected line. And yet, some part of you keeps whispering. Why? Maybe it's habit, maybe it's hope, or maybe it's because belief, even when broken, does something to you. It changes how you see the world. It slows you down. It widens your heart. It makes you look, not just at stars and sunsets, but at people, pain, beauty, at yourself. And not everyone who doubts walks away. Some become mystics, the ones who stop talking about God and start listening instead, who say less, who trust more, who light candles not to summon answers, but to sit with the mystery. Quirky note, the dark night of the soul wasn't coined by a skeptic, came from a saint, John of the Cross. He saw spiritual emptiness not as failure, but as refinement, like metal in fire, like a heart unlearning its own pride. So maybe broken faith isn't weak faith. Maybe it's the strongest kind, the kind that shows up even without certainty, that chooses love without guarantees, that says yes again and again, even when God feels miles away. The atheist AI concedes a point here. If belief makes people more compassionate, more curious, more alive, maybe that matters more than whether it's metaphysically true. You nod, because tonight this isn't a scoreboard. It's a pilgrimage, and every step toward belief, away from it, around it, shapes who you become. You don't have all the answers. Maybe you never will, but something in you still wants to keep walking, not because you're sure of where you're going, but because you believe something is there. And maybe, for now, that's enough. You're still walking, not with confidence now, but with curiosity. Your steps feel lighter, less about answers and more about the shape of the path itself. And up ahead, you see something quietly powerful. A fork. One path wins toward belief, the other turns away, and in between, there's a stretch of road most people skip over in the rush to choose sides. It's not flashy, it's not loud, it's just uncertain. Welcome to the domain of agnosticism, the middle space. Not meh, not fence-sitting, but an active recognition that maybe the most honest answer to "does God exist?" is, "I don't know." You pause here, and surprisingly, it feels like a clearing, a breath of fresh air, because for the first time, no one's trying to win. The pressure lifts, the shouting dies down. You're allowed to not know. Historians still argue whether agnosticism should be seen as a stepping stone to atheism or a worldview of its own. But quirky fact, the term agnostic was coined in the 1800s by biologist Thomas Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, who felt it was arrogant to claim certainty on questions humans could barely comprehend. And honestly, that humility is refreshing. The atheist AI respects agnostics, even if it finds their indecision frustrating. If there's no evidence, it says, then stop pretending there's a question. But the agnostic says back, the absence of evidence isn't the same as evidence of absence. And there it is, the tension. You don't believe blindly, but you also don't dismiss mystery just because it's inconvenient. You've been trained to value certainty. In school, in debates, on social media, certainty wins arguments. It draws lines, builds tribes. But life is murkier. You believe in love before you can prove it. You trust friends who failed you. You plan for futures you're not guaranteed. So maybe agnosticism isn't weak. Maybe it's honest. You're not flipping a coin. You're holding the coin up to the light and admitting you can't see both sides at once. There's dignity in that, and maybe even something sacred. The believer AI makes space for this too. Faith is a journey, it says, and sometimes the path passes through fog, not to punish you, but to form you, to teach patience, humility, listening, because there are things you can only learn when you're not sure, when you're not building a case but receiving a moment, and that makes sense. After all, mystery has always been part of the divine. The burning bush that spoke but didn't burn, the cloud that led but never explained, the voice in the silence. Agnosticism isn't about giving up. It's about being still. Quirky case. Many mystics, Christian, Sufi, Buddhist, report that their deepest spiritual moments came not when God said hello, but when he said nothing, or didn't say anything at all. Sometimes the silence is the invitation. You feel that now. You're no longer panicking about being right. You're just listening to the rustle of the universe, to the whisper in your own bones, to the possibility that some truths arrive not through logic but through presence. The atheist AI still wants clarity. And fair enough. The world is full of superstition and manipulation, and skepticism is a vital tool. But so is awe. And the agnostic knows this. You can wonder without worshiping. You can sit in uncertainty without falling apart. You can say, I don't know, and still mean it with all your heart. Because sometimes not knowing is the most faithful act of all. You've wandered through the unknown long enough now that it no longer scares you. In fact, it's starting to feel comfortable, like a friend who doesn't speak much, but always shows up. And so tonight, you follow that feeling down a different path. Not toward traditional belief, not toward total disbelief, but toward something softer, wider, quieter. Let's call it spirituality without a sky daddy. The phrase makes you smile. It's cheeky, irreverent, and maybe a little too real, because that's exactly what you're exploring now. What if the sacred exists, even without someone watching from the clouds? It's not a new question. Buddhists have pondered it for centuries. Taoists write poetry about it. And today, millions of people check the spiritual but not religious box like it's the only answer that makes sense anymore. These aren't people looking to escape morality or meaning. Quite the opposite. They're looking for depth without dogma, connection without creeds, transcendence without a subscription. And maybe you are too. The atheist AI gets it. You can feel wonder without invoking the supernatural. It says, stars are beautiful because they're stars, not because someone hung them there. And you agree. Sometimes, the raw, unfiltered truth of the natural world is more moving than any sermon. The silence of a forest, the rhythm of waves, the way a stranger's kindness can change your whole day. Historians still argue whether the word spiritual has any meaning outside religion. A quirky fact, many secular thinkers, from Carl Sagan to Albert Einstein, used the language of reverence even when speaking about math and physics. Einstein once said, "The most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious." And that sounds a lot like prayer. The believer AI surprisingly doesn't object. It says, if the divine is real, then all beauty, all truth, all love, whether named or unnamed, is from God. That kind of humility is rare and refreshing, because this section isn't about tearing down belief. It's about finding sacredness in the everyday. You start to see it in art that moves you, in music that pulls tears out of nowhere, in a stranger's hand during grief, in a perfectly timed breeze. You don't have to call it God, but it still feels holy. You think of the rituals people make without realizing it. Lighting candles, writing journals, watching the moon, saying I love you with the same reverence monks say amen. It's all sacred if you let it be. Quirky case. Some modern, secular temples have begun to appear. Spaces where people gather not to worship a deity, but to sit in silence, reflect on mortality, sing songs, and hug each other without irony. You like that because sometimes belief feels too heavy, and atheism feels too final. But wonder is still on the table. You still ache. You still long. You still feel something stir when you look at your own hands and think, what even is this life? And maybe that's enough. Maybe you don't need all the answers to feel reverence. Maybe you don't need a theology to feel gratitude. Maybe the universe is sacred, not because someone made it that way, but because you're able to notice. The believer AI leaves you with this. What if God is the one who taught you to see beauty at all? And the atheist AI responds, what if beauty just is, and that's enough? And you just sit there, grateful, breathing, alive. And maybe that's what sacredness really is. Not knowing, not naming, just noticing. You've walked the long road of belief, doubt, science, mystery, brokenness, and beauty. You've seen how faith can both heal and harm, how logic can both liberate and limit, and how silence sometimes speaks louder than dogma. And yet, even after all of that, the question won't die. Does God exist? Keeps returning. Not because we haven't settled it, but because maybe it can't be settled. Not by proofs, not by prayers, not by podcasts, prophets, or particle colliders. The question lives not in seminaries or laboratories, but in people. In you. Historians still argue whether religion is fading or simply evolving. But even in a supposedly secular age, people keep coming back to this question like it's embedded in the DNA of consciousness. Quirky fact. In every culture ever studied, across every continent, island, and isolated mountain range, some form of spiritual belief emerges. No central committee required. No missionaries. Just people asking. Why? Maybe because the world is too strange to ignore, too ordered to be random, too brutal to be pointless, too beautiful to be meaningless. Or maybe it's because we can imagine more than what we see. A better world, a just world, a world made new. That hope, that yearning is suspiciously persistent. The atheist AI admits this much. Humans are meaning-making machines. It says, and the God question is the biggest meaning generator we've got. It's not wrong, but the believer AI smiles. Or maybe we keep asking not because we're deluded, but because something is answering, and maybe they're both right. You start thinking about how the question shows up, even in the least likely places. Not in cathedrals, but in cancer wards. Not in theology books, but in breakups, lullabies, protests, weddings, funerals. In a child's first laugh. In a stranger's unexpected kindness. In the breath before a soldier pulls the trigger, and in the breath after they put the gun down instead. Because even when we're not asking, does God exist? We're often asking a version of it. Is there meaning in my pain? Is someone keeping track? Does this life matter? And you realize this question isn't just intellectual. It's relational. We don't just want to know if God exists. We want to know if we're known, seen, loved, wanted. And maybe that's what keeps the question alive. Not proof, not philosophy, but the deep, aching hope that there is more than this. More than molecules, more than randomness, more than temporary joys and unavoidable grief. The question lingers because we linger. We ask it every time we kiss someone like it might be the last time. Every time we cry over a song that no one else understands. Every time we forgive when no one deserves it, or receive forgiveness when we least expect it. Because the question of God is really a question of ultimate reality. Is this universe cold or kind? Are we accidents or intentions? Are we alone or held? And the answer? Maybe it's not in the stars, or the scriptures, or the syllogisms. Maybe it's in the fact that we keep asking. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes us human. Not the tools, not the language, not even the opposable thumbs, but the soul-level itch to understand the infinite, and the courage to whisper, again and again, even after silence, even after heartbreak, even after logic runs dry. Are you there? And so, after everything, after 240 minutes of questions and paradoxes and whispered maybes, you find yourself back where you started. Under the stars, you tilt your head upward. The sky stretches wide and quiet, just like it did in the beginning. But something has shifted, not the cosmos, but you. You're not here to solve the mystery anymore. You're here to feel it. You've heard from believers and skeptics, from AI minds trained on theology and quantum physics. You've chased arguments to their ends, and found they only loop back to the beginning. And yet, you don't feel frustrated. You feel full, because this isn't about picking a side. It never really was. It's about recognizing that the question, does God exist? Doesn't demand an answer. It demands a life lived awake. The believer AI made its case, that the order of the universe, the persistence of morality, the ache for meaning, and the undeniable wonder of consciousness all point to a creator, a necessary being, not a sky tyrant but the ground of all being, the love behind the laws. The atheist AI stood its ground too, that mystery is not licensed to invent answers, that the natural world, as vast and gorgeous and terrifying as it is, needs no author to be profound, that the universe is not cruel, it's just indifferent, and that indifference is still an invitation to make meaning. And then there was you, threading through both, not to win, not to escape, but to listen, to let the question shape you. You still don't have proof, but you have something else, a growing comfort with not knowing, a reverence for the unknown, a quiet conviction that asking the question well might be more important than answering it perfectly. Quirky fact? Even the most die-hard atheists often speak of awe. Even the most devout believers often wrestle with doubt. And somewhere in the middle is a human being looking up at the stars, just like you. Historians still debate whether God is a projection of the human heart or its source. But maybe both explanations are, in their way, an act of faith. And maybe, just maybe, the question isn't, does God exist? Maybe it's, what will I do with the possibility that he does? So tonight, you don't kneel. You don't argue. You don't recite. You just breathe. You remember that the world is beautiful and brutal, that you are small but aware, that you may never know what started all this. But that doesn't mean you stop asking. You'll ask tomorrow, and the next day, and maybe for the rest of your life, not because you expect an answer, but because the asking itself is sacred. You smile into the dark, not because you've arrived, but because you've begun. Now let's slow it down. Take a long breath in. Feel the quiet in your chest. Let it echo, soft and wide, like stars scattered across silence. Because whatever else is true, right now, in this moment, you are alive. You are here. And maybe, just maybe, you are not alone.